Bonjour à
Hello everyone, welcome in this amphitheater number 5 at the Rencontre économique d'Aix-en-Provence. I'm glad to be with you and moderating this morning session, which is entitled Towards a New Way of Sharing Value. This is a topical subject, if any, because this is at the very heart of the social anger that wreaks havoc in the country with the political consequences that we all know. I would like to give you a few figures. Inflation, purchasing power, that's the first motivation for the vote. That's 58% purchasing for 58% of the population. Purchasing power is the important argument. 68% for those that vote for the far right. So that's a subject of high concern for everyone. And we will have high quality speakers. We have the Secretary General of Socotec. You're dealing with certifications, and you can talk about sharing values in your sector, within your group, Mr. Hervé Maujontin. Then Gwenola Chambon, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founding partner of Vauban Infrastructure Partners. You are specialized in infrastructures. You have an outreach in France and in Europe. We've talked during the coffee on these subjects, the value chain, partners of different projects. We also have Bertrand Dumazy, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Edenred, and we've talked about tagging expenditures and about ticket vouchers and subjects that are subjects of debate. Also, we have Luc Mathieu, who's the national. You've been working on the interprofessional agreement on value sharing. You'll talk about social partners, trade unions, and how you take part in that debate. And then we have Hippolyte Dalbise, who comes from the Cercle des Économistes and who's going to give some background information for this debate. Hello, everyone. Thank you. What I will do is give you the viewpoint of economists, this idea of sharing value. This is an old topic, maybe as old as economic science, as economics is large. I'm going to talk about the large trends that have arisen. So companies create added value. We do the sum of all this added value. We have the GDP, and the issue right now is to know how we can share the sum of added value between work and capital. That's the traditional opposition between work and capital. There are two production factors, two ways of creating value. That's actually work and capital that is aggregated by capitalists. That's the fundamental notion of inequalities in the way we apprehend economics. So it's not that easy to sketch out. We have to see the apportionment of work and capital. Work will be the mean salary times the number of salaried employees, and then the capital, that would be capital income times the quantity of capital, and the sum should be 1 or 2. So why is it not that easy? It's because we have taxation as well. We know that. We have to apportion it between the workers and capitalists, and there are a lot of complex situations like auto-entrepreneurs. Is it capital? Is it work? We have to be able to define and determine that. Economists are working on this. Then afterwards, we look into the evolution of the share of work in the added value throughout time. And that gives us an element that sheds light on the degree of inequality between production and capital production, and some hunches about income inequalities, since capital is much more concentrated than work in the population. If you have an increase of capital in the added value, then you would expect for having an increase in inequalities. We do that for a large number of countries, and we use data of national accountability. So we have baselines. We can do a comparison from one country to another. And since the 60s, there's a drop in the work contribution to added value. And we've seen it in most countries. And in France, with a momentum that is less smooth than elsewhere, it's quite net. It's quite clear in the 70s we would stand at 68% for the contribution of work to the added value. And there was a huge drop in the 80s. And now we are stabilized since the beginning of the 90s at 62%. What are the explanations of these evolutions? I'm not going to talk about France. We're going to talk a lot about France. But what are the developments, the explanations as set out by the economists to explain this global trend? I'm not going to be very specific. I'm not going to talk about public policy or a production structure that enable us to determine the national momentum, but also we try to sketch out the large trends and to outline the patterns. First is technical progress, which is more and more linked to capitalization, to production of capital. For a company that is technologically successful, then it will be successful, and that takes a lot of capital. Then, something that is quite strange, the price of capital has decreased, the interest rates are quite low, and we have a substitution. Since the capital is less costly, we accumulated more capital to the detriment of work, and this explains why it takes so much weight. The second point, that's the margin rates of superstars, some large corporations that take up a large part of the added value worldwide. And these are giants, these are superstars, and they are very capitalistic. So to increase that, the weight of capital has also increased. And then a second element, that salaried employees, they are less well represented. I can't say less well, but representatives are less powerful. I pay attention. I need to be careful. They had less success defending the salaried employees, so their interest and benefits are less, and their salaries increased less in proportion to the increase of capital. There are two questions that are largely to be raised. What is the right level of apportionment between work and capital? And secondly, if we want to change that level, what are the tools that we could use to do so? What are the instruments that could be set up by public policy to amend this apportionment? Thank you. Thank you. Hervé Mongetin, would you like to give some insight on this subject from the angle of your company? Thank you. Sorry for my voice, because I just come back from Germany, and I certainly had a shock because of the difference of temperature from one country to another. Just let's go back to the subject. Of course, my input will be from a microeconomical point of view. Socotec is a 1.4 billion company, 46,000 employees. 26% is out of France and in the US. We were standing at 500 million euros of turnover. What we do is we do risk management in the building and infrastructure world. Socotec's story is the wake-up of a French company that has more than 70 years of existence. It was sleeping, and after 7 and 8 years, it woke up, and it had a wonderful leader that had international outreach. What happened was that there was an LBO, and that allowed us to do more than 60 purchases. I'm going back to the sharing of value. When I joined the company, The subject of value sharing culturally, I'm talking about France here, was extremely permeable in the discussions. We were talking about cooperative because that was part and parcel of the history of the company. It ended in 2008, but it had lost the notion of yield, of performance, of long-term visions. This is part and parcel of its purpose, its DNA. There's a short-term vision, there's a notion of performance, but we needed to go back to this notion of performance. And we managed it quite well. The trajectory of putting performance at the heart of our concerns enabled us also to give the right place to value sharing, because we need to create value if we want to share value. And our history is quite specific. We are people's business with engineers, so there's a war of talents, so there's also a market regulation that is being exercised. We did it on a step-by-step basis, and we improved performance. That allowed us to give leeway with some interest sharing and bonuses with the LBO. I managed to have 400 people in the LBO vessel, and we managed to have an employee share grant as a bonus. And that gave some incentives to the employees, which was quite interesting. So that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to put yield and performance at the very heart of our concerns and our objectives, and so that we follow the path that would then give some balance between performance and value sharing. It's not impossible with an LBO. It's more difficult, but it's still. And I would like to highlight another point. With value sharing, there's also all the externalities that the company's trajectory requires to follow. There's a high intensity of human capital. So we need to share value, but for this, we need to invest in employability, in scaling up of skills, and also to attract talents that do not have yet all the skills that we require. We want to share with you the fact that value sharing goes beyond financial aspects. It's also human capital sharing. And this is what the company needs to do. It's all the more necessary if we want to keep our talents and if we want to retain our employees. This is very interesting what you're saying. So I will give the floor to Mrs. Chambon. Do you want to say a few words about what we've just said? Yes. Regarding the management company that I manage, Vauban Infrastructure Partners. The name is emblematic of our strong commitment, something that reflects our commitment for a balance of value sharing. Vauban has drafted a whole treaty on value sharing. At the time, it was actually a disruptive agreement because in terms of taxation, it did a lot. What we did is that we put at the same level all the salaries of men and women and for the same job, with the same level of experience, everybody was paid at the same level. 43% of our employees are women, which is quite atypical. And we managed to have 40% of our employees, 40% of our employees have invested and bought some shares of the company. We also have investment funds with long-term horizons and commitments. And the long-term investment for employees, it's actually a commitment also towards the company. When we want to commit for the long term. Because when we have a long duration of time, we can build a dialogue fed with all the stakeholders of a project. Because when we actually address infrastructure, it will impact the lives of everyone. We're dealing with roads, with airports, with hospitals, with universities, with heat factories and parking lots. And it is important to have that dialogue. And this translates into investment funds with 25-year long horizons. For instance, in France, we have worked on concessions of FTTH, that's optical fibers that would replace cables in copper for phone cables. And in the region of Hauts-de-France, we had a mixed trade union that was set up with the region partners and the département, which are the Nord and the Pas-de-Calais. And they set up a combined trade union to build the FTTH combination so as to fill the gap of digital gaps. And we invested a lot of capers. We actually worked with the elected representatives. We worked together on a network that would last 5 years. 70% of local companies were their services were used. We created job positions, and they actually turned out to be viable with this network. We created on the creation of platforms and that accounted for 80,000 hours of training. And ultimately, we also worked on inclusion with populations that were out of the system, were beyond 3 years of unemployment. And we created 50 jobs for these people. I would like to go back to what you just said, because this struck me. Regarding resorting to local companies, you have specific tools for job creation purposes. Yes. On the one hand, we have some call for tenders, for instance, for public procurement purposes. In the book of specifications will require a minimum level of jobs to be created at the local level, always. And then we'll see the allocation. One bidder can say, okay, I'm going to commit further. And this is what we did with Vauban, because this is a part and parcel of the DNA. We have commitments that we impose on the companies with which we work. So when I acquire interest, I'll have inclusion and performance objectives. And why is it important to have a longer horizon? Is because you won't know the result, the outcome after 3 years. You need a longer time. You need at least 10 years. This is why it is important to have long-term investments, as far as I'm concerned. This is very interesting. We were talking a lot about these questions earlier at the round table. Would you like to give your input? Yes. First, my angle is that of entrepreneur. I had a group that has outreach in 45 countries, from Santiago de Chile to Singapore. I have news to share with you. Actually, when we look at France, it is the champion of value sharing in favor of work. It might be disturbing what I'm saying. However, when we look at the percentage dedicated to work as opposed to capital, this is in France that it is the highest. And it is in France that it has decreased less since the 90s, basically. We stand at 65% for work right now. What does it mean? It means that we still have 35% left, 17% for capitalists, 65% for work, 17% for capitalists. That gives you an idea. So we're the world champion of value sharing in France, into the benefit of work via bonuses. We're the second country in the world where we have more variable remuneration. And we also have unprecedented systems such as interest sharing, acquisition of shares that could be done by employees as bonuses. And that's my trade, like restaurant vouchers. We also have different types of interests that we could be given to employees. And this is historical. We are a very good student in terms of value sharing. However, when we get out of the mean value, it's not equitable yet. There are inequalities, gender inequalities. There are inequalities between large companies and small companies and from an industrial sector to another. I have a solution to this. If you think about vouchers, for instance, that would be the same price, may it be for a business owner, an executive, a man or a woman. So we could rebalance this out in a global situation that is already good. And there's another thing. As an observer, I'm lucky because I walk around in 45 countries. The problem is we don't create enough added value. We share it well, but we don't make the pie bigger, so we have less pie to share. So if you look into investments in France in R&D, research and development, that accounts to 2.25% of GDP. However, in the US, it's 3.65% of GDP. If you look at the trajectory of investment into innovation, we should invest 130 billion more in France over the next 20 years to catch up on our delay as versus the US. Without investment in innovation, we can't create added value. This is why in France we need to accept this idea. We need to invest more. The second reason for which we do not create enough added value, and I won't make friends here, we don't work enough in France. We don't work enough during the week. We don't work long enough, and the unemployment percentage, which is structurally 2% more than what we have elsewhere in Europe, is such that we don't work enough. If we don't work enough, if we don't invest enough, then there's no added value created. And then it will be difficult to share value because the problem is that the pie that we want to share is too small for too many children. When I see and I observe other countries, I can say that in France we have no consensus on values. If we want to create value, we need to agree as French people on what values are. And I would share with you my belief on 3 values that are essential. The first is that there's nothing better than liberal democracy. And I can see it because I saw it in some countries that decided to get out of liberal democracy. It's a fragile baby. It was born recently. It is very fragile because it relies on the freedom of each of us. And if we do not respect the codes of liberal democracy, it may disappear altogether. In the world, I've been in countries where liberal democracy has disappeared, and I could guarantee that this is not a good thing. In France, we need to understand and agree that there's nothing better than liberal democracy. Something else in which I agree is market economy. Over a long period of time, all countries that got out of this did not create any more added value. This 65% of French people say, market economy. Well, I'm not that sure that it is the good thing. Well, I'm sure it is, because over the long time, when I saw everything that happened in the world, there's nothing better. And second and third value is Europe. We are French, but we are also Europeans. I've been in Asia. I've been in Latin America. And I think that Europe has a message to convey. We have much more common denominators in Europe than sources of conflicts. That's what I want to say. If we want to share value, we need to create value. To create value, we need to agree on values. And if we don't agree on values, then there will be no creation of value and no value to share. And if the pie is not bigger, then the sharing of value becomes difficult. And then I have bad news for you. Capital ends by winning over work if there's no creation of value. It's difficult to address all issues, but I would like to give the floor to Henri Mathieu because you're at the very heart of this debate. And there was a debate on sharing of value. The companies between 11 to 55 employees need to set up the same scheme. Can you tell us about this? What are the claims around this? Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Before talking about this, I would like to say that before we talk about creation of value, we are capable of measuring that with a monetary value, but there are also concrete outcomes that are not measurables. When we have a good educational system, we create value, but we don't know how to measure it. We know its cost, but we don't know how much benefit it has. Health system, that's the same thing. When we have a system of solidarity, we create value as well. That's what I wanted to say. We have the creation of financial value, and there's extra financial value, and sometimes it's difficult to assess. When we look into financial value, you've said it before, we fund via taxation, we give remuneration, and we generate income through capital. It is a very important subject because with the tax we can fund education and health, for instance. We talk about taxation of companies, and from this point of view, the issue that is being raised is equality before taxation, because for corporate income tax it's 25% for all companies, but we all know that the effective taxation rate of companies depends and varies highly, especially for companies that can do tax optimization. That means to do tax avoidance of part of their P&L. I'm not saying that because it's not only marginal. Some assess it to 40 billion a year, and some economists says that it actually weighs upon. It has a significant weight upon the whole money in question. That actually takes a toll on public expenditures and sharing of value for workers, because this is out of. It disappears altogether. So when we talked about remuneration of work, that's the matter of salaries. That's what we talk about. That's actually essentially what is being paid out. We have talked during negotiations on interprofessional agreement on value sharing. There were 3 subjects that would affect the different industries. A minimum salary for each industry sector and their compliance with the minimum salary that is the statutory one. What is a professional industrial sector? That's a range of companies in the same sector that decide to have a common foundation of social benefits, basically. And amongst the sectorial agreements, you have a hierarchy of remuneration, you have different employment positions, and you decide to have a minimum salary that should be above the statutory minimum wage. And they decide on career paths for these employees. And this is very important for salaries. But when it doesn't work, we have a problem of promotion hurdles. Why? In some industrial sectors, most of the classifications are under the statutory minimum wage. I'm going to be crystal clear with an example. For instance, in pharmacists, we have a title that is scattered out over 6 levels of classification. Out of these 16 levels, 14 have a minimum wage that is under the statutory minimum wage. And we need a certain number of months of work to reach each level. So that means that for 28 months, you have to be paid under the statutory minimum wage. And this is why a lot of people lose hope, especially when you have strong increases of the statutory minimum wage. Some people thought that they would not benefit from it, and now it's increasing. And so some are losing hope because they do not have access to these benefits. So the question of compliance with the statutory minimum wage is one question that is really important.
And it's interesting to talk to pharmacists with this. The third question, equal pay between men and women. On the same pay, doing the same job, that is a concept was adopted in 1946 in the Constitution. Some 80 years later, we've not achieved it. So there really is a true problem from that point of view. And out of those three subjects, the National Interprofessional Agreement has made some commitments. Employers have made some promises on these questions. And the least that I can say today is that absolutely nothing has happened. And so, above and beyond these subjects, there's also the question of true negotiations and being faithful to what you commit to when you're talking to your negotiating partners. It's all very important. And after all of this, there are more classic measures such as participation, bonuses. These kind of things can be described. Well, they have a major defect, and because they only apply to half of the employees, and they only apply to big companies. If there are fewer than 55 employees, they don't have a participation scheme. And the reason for negotiating this agreement was to include more salaried employees in these schemes. So several measures have been taken, including the obligation for different industrial sectors to start negotiating before the 30th of June last to enable their employees to participate in profits, and for those smaller businesses to pay into a profit-sharing scheme as of next year, if for 3 consecutive years they have had made a profit. So in terms of negotiation here, these participation schemes can they can take a side step from the legal framework, but not a lot is happening. There haven't been any agreements signed on this front for the past 18 months, despite all of the talk. And so the value sharing scheme is a relation to this special bonus that was created after the Yellow Vest demonstrations. And it is a bonus that is not subject to taxation for many employees. And I'm not going to repeat what I was talking about, funding, social protection and pensions, etc. There will be a taxation and a social aspect from that point of view. There are 2 major hurdles in order to share profit. One of them is INSEE has identified that it is used instead of a salary. INSEE has said that when you're talking about profit sharing, 30% was paid as a salary. So I note that quite a few candidates in this electoral campaign have been suggesting that this bonus goes up to 10,000 euros and is paid out every month. But it's a bonus that is not taxed and it is paid every month, whereas the salary, you can't have a bonus which is the same thing as a salary. And I'd just like to wrap up. I noted in a document some sentences. Is a value the only thing that needs to be shared in a company? The second one is clear that democratic principles must now cover other spheres than politics, i.e. companies, businesses. So this text, this law, is talking about value sharing. It's not a left-wing document. It was written by the Management Association, the MEDEF, here in France. So it was a document that was drawn up from a negotiation. It talks about governance, power sharing in businesses. And so we really are lagging behind in France when you compare us with the rest of Europe. 18 European countries have put these negotiations in place. 1/3 of councils are made up of employees, and that's not the case here in France. There are much fewer employees on different councils. There are some thresholds, of course, which are very substantial. So there's a whole load of work that can be carried out to be explored. Yes, I'd just like to give you the floor again. We see that the social dialogue is not being very efficient and it's not being followed by actions. You were talking about sharing this pie and how it's shared. And there is a strong feeling among the French, which is fueling the vote for extreme parties, that there's a wage gap. Between 2019 and 2022, big bosses' salaries went up by 20%, whereas the employees didn't go up as much. And so this is fueling the impression that when the pie gets bigger, well, all of the kind of whipped cream on top goes to the big bosses and the poor workers don't get any benefit. So there's a lot of feeling there. Would you like to react to that? How can one make sure that there is a better dialogue on these subjects? Well, I wanted to speak on a completely different topic, but now you've asked me that question. I wanted to talk with my neighbor here. I wanted to say, if you take this value sharing bonus, you say there are 30% which would nevertheless have been paid as a salary anyway. Well, one could say there are 70% which would not have been paid as a salary. So yes, the system is not perfect, but let's not see this glass half full rather than half empty. 70% of that money would not have been paid. It's not a perfect system, but it is a huge step forward all the same. Do you not agree? Okay. I've got nothing against value sharing bonuses. However, you cannot substitute a salary. You can't construct your life on variable bonuses, which may or may not come in at the end of the month. So I think the key part of your remuneration has to be your salary. So you won't be able to get accommodation just on the strength of your bonuses. It's not status enough. And with your lunch and vouchers, that's not going to help you anyway either. How I can eat properly every day thanks to those luncheon vouchers. Yes, I'm not against luncheon vouchers. I run the system for the different unions, so there's no problem on that score. However, what I'm trying to say here is, how can a salary remain the reference when you're talking about sharing values, and that can be up to 10,000 euros a year and paid out on a monthly basis? I think that's problematic. Yes, I agree with you, and I would go one step further. That's where men and women of goodwill can agree. We have talked about a decent wage, and a decent wage is probably a very good unit of measurement. In other words, when a man or a woman is paid a salary and has to raise a family on it, if you cannot raise your family decently on that salary, there is a problem with your salary. And as you were saying, there are other measures which can be very positive as well that can help boost remuneration. And well, there are different streams of remuneration. Yes, but in the case in hand, we agree one cannot survive on a bonus because you can't be sure it's going to come in every year. And on the other hand, 70%, but on the other hand, no, 70% of that money would not have been paid. So all in all, we will manage to find a solution. Hervé, did you want to come in? No, let's not applaud everyone every 5 minutes, otherwise we'll never get anything done. I think we mustn't just focus only on that value sharing bonus. That mustn't monopolize all of our attention because it's a one-off thing. We must note that it has been a huge success. I am at the head of a big industry because we've made acquisitions, and so I am in touch with many small business owners, and I can now note that regulation is so complex, and that is a big problem for the owners of these small businesses. A SME boss or owner in his or her DNA has the notion of sharing value with the owners. Anyone who says the opposite is just not being completely true. These entrepreneurs are very generous at heart, and when an entrepreneur plans to sell their business, the main reason is because they've reached a kind of threshold. So once I've got 50 employees, things start becoming too complicated. I love my job, I love what I do, I love my trade, my profession, but all of the rest of it, the management and everything, is just getting too complicated. So I'd be better off selling on to a bigger structure who can cope with all of that. And so that's what, when Bertrand was saying we have to see the glass half full, yes, of course, there are some positive effects. However, we need simplicity. And a second point, if I may, there's one topic which we haven't touched upon, which is a bit crazy. The main regulation factor of value sharing is demographics. So we are entering into a period where there's a lowering of that figure. So businesses have been dynamic in their remuneration policies up until now, and those better than those who are outside the system. I think those who are in businesses today, in companies today, don't feel what you're describing. Well, I think there is a war of talents. This is a question of supply and demand. The English-speaking world is much more used to that kind of thing, to those cycles. We, here in the Mediterranean side of Europe, we see things differently. We're entering into long periods of lowering amounts of employees who are available. There is talent, but a business's ability to share value, starting with the salary, but which will then lead into developing skills and talents and sharing power within the business. Well, they are doing that according to what's going on in the real world. It's not just a question of codes and form. It's a question of demographic dynamics. And for me, this is absolutely obvious, and that is what is at work today. But is there not a kind of lack of symmetry there? You've talked about market regulation due to the talent war. However, is that not more the case in some sectors rather than others? There are some managers who can be more mobile and they have a strong lever for negotiation. Well, of course that's the case. That's why French society is seen as being very fragmented. We see, yes, there are some people who are taking advantage of globalization. They see it as positive, as an opportunity, and others will see it as a huge threat. So, but we need everybody, of course. And we saw this during COVID. Those were the jobs on the front line. Those jobs had key social and economic value. We need those jobs, and we need to invest in those people who do those jobs. And we have to be able to look forward for them. There are many surveys have been carried out about that. We know that there will be difficulties ahead. I believe that we are much closer to the first industrial revolution, even when we're talking about sharing capital, than the other industrial revolutions. I think there's going to be some kind of technical disruption. It can be quite brutal, and it can jeopardize our liberal democracies, in which I believe more than ever. But companies do have a role to play. I believe less in that notion of making businesses more democratic. You've got a work contract, and that means that you are kind of renouncing on some of your freedom. You are not a citizen of your company, and we need to take that into account. However, the business has to win over the loyalty of its employees. And you can't have different speeds within the same workforce. And I think that's what we experienced during COVID and immediately after that. Companies today work quite well in terms of social cohesion. They're quite solid, and I think those of us who are at the head of businesses, we have a strong responsibility to maintain this. I'd like to come back a little bit on what you were talking about those people who are employed in companies and who create the sales figures, but it's the feeling of many people who work and who are in those first-line jobs, which we were talking about a lot during COVID, and they are concerned by the things we were talking about. Well, let's talk about remote working, working from home. From the very outset, I was against that. I don't want to be a dinosaur, but of course we have to offer our workers the opportunity to work from home. But working from home is contributing to the fragmentation of society, because some people cannot work from home. And so some people say on Friday, I'm working from home, so I'll catch the fast train to get to the other end of France. My children do this, and those people who have got a decent education can do that. The problem is that is fragmenting society. So that kind of debate that we've had about is working from home fostering a lowering of productivity or an increase, I think that's not the debate to be had. I think it is rendering society fragmented. We're all moving at different speeds. So let me give you an example here. When you are a company that has people working from home, you have to try and generate this cohesion. You have to create a united workforce. And what are the stakes there? Of course, yes, you can offer participation in profit, but it's a much broader issue than just that. Gonella, you wanted to chime in here? Yes. I think this is a wake-up call here, what with the elections that we've got going on here. As a society and as company leaders, we all have a role to play to try and engage in a constructive dialogue so that we can have more social cohesion. When we see the younger generations who are looking for something else, they have different values to us. They really want to have an employer brand. We carried out a survey with Salmon in Consulting about what values youngsters cherish, and we brainstormed with the bosses of all the different companies we invested in to identify how we need to reinvent ourselves, the conversation that we have to have when we're conversing in order to recruit. That message has to change. And when you're talking about digitization and working from home, there is no choice here. We've all been through COVID. People have sampled that and they now want to use it as a tool. We mustn't deny that. It is a tool that will make work more flexible. But by the same token, we mustn't tip into a style of work where everybody's working from home and we lose that collective notion of working together all in the same place. So it's a question of scale, really. I think that we all have to make things move forward and solve this major disruption. I think today in the world, not only just in France, we're all very individualistic, and youngsters are very paradoxical, if you like, because on the one hand they're very individualistic, but by the same token they feel like orphans of a framework with which they're not familiar, in fact. And so a business, a company, offers a kind of framework. I believe that one of the roles of a boss today, above and beyond making sure that the company is high performing, is to guarantee that framework. And then each business has its own characteristics, its number of workers, the profile of the workers, etc. However, I believe it really is more important than ever. And Mathieu, you wanted to come in on this? Luc Mathieu, rather. Yeah, I do not agree about youngsters being individualistic. People have been saying that for the past 40 years. I think youngsters are available to commit to the same degree as 50 years ago. The only difference is in how they commit. But that's another ball game. Businesses are not bubbles disconnected from the world. You can take a look at what's happening in the business and what's happening outside. I think there's a very interesting study which was released just a few weeks ago about the link between working conditions, autonomy within different professions, and voting, political voting. And we can see that there is a correlation between both of those things. And when you have poor working conditions, when you have no autonomy at work, then statistically speaking, you will tend to work for the National Front rather than if you have better working conditions. So and COVID, as we've mentioned, is a big factor. We are now in a different world. That's just the way things are. That is reality today. And that's not going to change. So company bosses and all of those who hope to organize businesses have to. Now, I don't work from home, but I have to realize that working from home is something that a lot of people want to do. And one study said that managers, if they weren't allowed to work from home anymore, well, half of those managers said that I would change my job. I would move to another company. That is the reality. That's just the way things are. And so we must not try and impose the old situation on today's situation. So perhaps a last comment before we open up the floor? Yes, I wanted just to say that the thing which is striking me in this discussion is that as a company head, you're walking on a tightrope. You're constantly trying to keep things balanced. Balancing in how value is shared. We've talked about capital and work, but it's also client and supplier. It's you have to share things on a more general basis, so you're on a tightrope in the short, medium, and long terms. What I'm also seeing is that fellow citizens are saying if there is a situation which is still surviving, it's that institution of the company. The company is an institution in which the companies have trust. And I take that as a responsibility because I have the trust of the French nation. I'm going to make sure that our business is the laboratory which works towards agreement. Yes, with social partners, if we're talking from sincerely and if we all respect our commitments and our promises, then we will be able to create things together. If each of us keeps in mind the medium and the long term, and I'm very, very sensitive to what you've taken about that bonus which will or not come in at the end of the month. We need a stable revenue every month we can count on. But then if all company bosses agree to walk on this tightrope, and if we can keep balance in this equation, and it's not always an easy job, but that's one of the responsibilities which has been entrusted to us. We must do it. And what I also share with you is that let's not forget that France works well in terms of value sharing. We can do better, of course. We need to find better balance, but that balance is possible. However, it will be easier if we manage to create more value. We need to create more value, so we're going to work on that and invest a little bit more. Work more, invest more. So we've got time for one or two questions, then Hippolyte will conclude. I think there should be a microphone. Please wait for the microphone before you ask your question. Hello. Thank you very much. Can you say a couple of words about mission-based businesses and whether you intend to get involved in such work? Would anyone like to catch that ball? Well, this is something we have taken a look at. We've looked at it closely. Because one of our board members, Sylvia, she talked to me a lot about it. She said, Bertrand, you should look at this kind of structure, and could we not evolve into that? This is something which we are looking at. There are plus points, negative points as well. But my question is, what would we do differently if we were a mission-based enterprise? I arrived at two conclusions. The first is that at Edenred, we could very well become such a structure, but we wouldn't really change what we do and how we do it. And if I could add to what Bertrand just said, for this particular type of subject, you have to be careful about trends. There might be a bit of a bubble about that. And it begs the question of what a company's role is in the longer term. And if a company cannot answer that question, then normally they have a question of appeal and identity. So we have worked a lot on this question because we've been in that landscape for over 70 years and seeing how it can be expressed. And we are fortunate enough to be at the very heart of risk management. Constructing different infrastructures. We're at the very heart of the environmental and the energy transitions. So we are really, really busy on that front for all of our stakeholders. But the next step along this line, well, I just want to see more proof of the pudding before I take any steps. We can have one question. So just quickly, just to come back to that question of Oxfam that you mentioned earlier on, but which wasn't really developed. You were talking about fragmentation. I think the figures there are absolutely startling. I'd like some clarification there because these are figures that could probably explain the fragmentation among the French population. Well, because we haven't got a lot of time, I'm going to conclude and answer at the same time. Yes, our society is fractured, so we were wondering what the correct way to share value is and how we can achieve this. And I think this panel reflects that a good value sharing is the result of negotiation. And I think that's very important. We are very committed to that. There's a real treasure that we have in France, i.e. we know how to discuss. We can discuss within our businesses, and we need to have the desire to do so. And we have to learn how to want to do that again. Thank you very much for listening and for all of your questions. Thank you, everybody.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chloé Morin. I'm a specialist in politics. I'm supposed to speak about how to go beyond communitarianism, and then I will give the floor to the moderator, Séverine Husson. What would be a definition of communitarianism? That's the temptation to be on oneself in some historical events, with each individual having their own roads, own codes, own rules, own religions. Sometimes they compete with the values of the Republic. That can be sometimes a reflex in times of difficulties. However, communitarianism is often seen as refusing, rejecting others, and that could lead to fights and combats. Should we talk about drifts or revolutions? This phenomenon has been seen on the other side of the Atlantic. The melting pot was supposed to have the acceptance of different entities to have a salad bowl and to be far away from the ideas of the United States that actually led to its genesis. In France, the President Jacques Chirac was the first one to phrase it on the 29th of January 1998, more than a quarter of a century ago in Mulhouse, on Alsace joining France. He said, France is not and never will be a mosaic of communities living with one another, communities that would face one another, fight against one another. Communitarianism has no space in France and should not exist. He saw signs of weaknesses in communitarianism. He saw that it could have an impact on social pact. Some reject it because they think that that's a negation of our republican ideas. Others think that that's the only way to make the voice of minorities heard that feel rejected. So our session would be dedicated to wondering if we should worry about this phenomenon and how we should respond to it with public policies, culture, affirmative action, representation of diversity, for instance. I'll give you the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chloé. There's a lot of things in which you have said, Chloé Morin, especially the evolution in the US, going from the dream of a melting pot to a salad bowl. We'll see whether this evolution is duplicated in our old Europe, in the old continent. And we'll try to look into solutions, into tools that we might have. Before introducing the guests, I would like to say a few words on this concept of communitarianism. It could be a trap. As Chirac has been mentioned, I will mention Emmanuel Macron. When he wanted to address this phenomenon in 2021, he decided not to call the law communitarianism, but rather law on separatism. It is actually, it has negative connotations. There's a matter of wanting to belong legitimately to a community, and communitarism is claims of new rights, new political organization. That's where the rubber hits the road here. We need to draw the line between belonging to a community and the problem of communitarianism. My name is Séverine Husson. I'm a journalist at La Croix. 10 seconds of self-promotion. The website of lacroix.com is in free access until Tuesday. If you don't know us, or if you don't know us very well, do not hesitate to access the to check out the website. It is free until Tuesday. So we have wonderful guests to answer these complicated questions. We have an international panel, so we can have an outlook from and insights from outside. We have Bintou Traoré. Bintou Traoré, you are an African feminist from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. You're also a journalist. You've done so many things. You created the Ivorian League of the Rights of Women, and you'll give us your input on the status of African women. Christophe Leribaud, you're the president of the Versailles Castle. You have been at the Villa de Médicis. You've worked for the Louvre museums. You have so many background experiences, and you're going to talk about culture. Maybe culture can be a way to appease things. Then we have Tabata Bull. You have the president of CCIB. You are CEO of a Canadian partnership for indigenous populations. Maybe you can talk about it. And you have been the CEO of the year, appointed by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And you're amongst the 100 lobbyists that are most influential in Canada, and you have been appointed so for many years now. And next to you, there's Christopher Caldwell. You are an American journalist. You've been working for the most prestigious English-speaking reviews and magazines like the Financial Times, or you have worked, or you're working. And there's a book that you published earlier, which resonates to our roundtable in 2011, A Revolution Under Our Eyes, How Islam is going to Change France and Europe. We'll start with you, Christopher Caldwell. This topic of salad bowl, multiculturalism, would you agree to that word? Would you make it your own? Can you give us background context on the evolution of the U.S. from the melting pot to the salad bowl evolution? I don't like this word multiculturalism, indeed, because it's a complex story, but multiculturalism has a long history, which is more due to political reasons than cultural reasons. That goes back to civic rights in the 60s when they were defended. What I thought was very interesting is what Chloe just said. I was in France in the 90s. She's talking about Jacques Chirac and so on. And at that time, during cohabitation, we had Chirac and Jospin at the time, and I remember I went to Place Beauvau when Jean-Pierre Chevènement was the minister there, and I talked to a deputy on immigrations from Muslims, and I asked, what about affirmative action, positive discrimination? And he said, well, it seems that you don't understand the constitutional system of France. For us, it is impossible. It does not exist, that type of communitarianism. But this is where we stand now. I won't speak too much at length on your politics because this is not my country. However, I would like to talk about the situation in the U.S. The U.S., in a certain way, has invented these concepts. We have a long history where we've tried to manage diversity starting from our Civil War during the 19th century. And after the Civil War, we've had important, complex issues to address. It was not enough to abolish slavery, but also we need to include people that were freed. We needed to create a more inclusive society. So we did have a lot of successes, but also a lot of failures. We've had segregation for a long time. In the 60s, we've had civic rights laws. In the 70s, in more ways than one, something that was very important. We've created a corpus of case law on the subject matter of how we could do inclusion, we could foster inclusion. So we have pursued this long-term policy, unlike other countries in Europe. France is an exception. It stands out partially on that subject. What I would like to point out today, this issue is full of contradictions. We've talked about promoting inclusion, to how to combat exclusion, how to promote diversity. But in many ways, most instances actually, these goals are very admirable, very laudable per se on their own, but they often contradict one another. They would build diversity. That's actually contradictory. Diversity and inclusion can be antagonizing, and we can actually delve into that later. Thank you. That's an interesting path of thought. Indeed, inclusion and diversity can actually antagonize one another. Chloe. Tabitha, how can we foster inclusion of different communities? You come from the first Canadian nations. What have you set up within your Canadian Council for Indigenous Populations, CCAB? What do you do to include minorities?
The opportunity to be here and to share in learnings with all of you. It's a pleasure to participate in an event. I was saying earlier, it's a pleasure to participate in an event that not only looks at economics, but also considers important facets of poverty, trust, society, diversity, and community. And as a female First Nation engineer, I suppose I tick a lot of boxes, but I don't always have a loud voice or an opportunity to use my voice. So I appreciate all of you being here. You know, the role of companies as agents of diversity and inclusion is pivotal and necessary conversation, particularly when we consider not only the unique and enhanced impact of our key concerns, such as climate change, the widening social economic gaps, and scarcity of resources on those communities that have been excluded and colonized. And don't forget the opportunity that including these communities also already presents. And this is the work that we do. In a world shaped by interconnected economies and diverse societies, the imperative for companies to champion diversity and foster inclusivity has never been more pronounced. But I want to take a note about being cautious about the general use of terms in this space. Every community who seeks equity and is deserved inclusion has their own unique perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds beyond the demographics of race, gender, and age. Before we speak about inclusivity, those unique histories must be learned, understood, respected, and in some instances, like Canada with Indigenous people, atoned for. Inclusion, on the other hand, ensures that all individuals feel valued, respected, and empowered to contribute fully to their organization's success. And we must not forget the difference between equity and equality. Treating everyone as equal is not the same as providing equitable opportunities. From an economic perspective, we must come to an understanding that those unique perspectives enrich organizational culture and drive innovation. Research consistently demonstrates that companies with diverse and inclusive workplaces and teams are more innovative, adaptable, and capable of outperforming their competitors. I have much to say on the need for support, inclusion, and dismantling of structures that hold women back from not only thriving, but bringing their incredible emotional and measured intelligence to the economy. But I'll provide a few examples specifically on the unique perspectives of Indigenous communities in Canada. While I am a proud Canadian, I am also a First Nation person in a country which has a does not have an incredible reputation or history with Indigenous people. In fact, it was illegal for Indigenous people to sell goods, to participate in the economy. If we obtained a post-secondary degree, we had to be removed from our communities. And despite those historical injustices, we have persisted. Indigenous people make up 5% of the population of Canada, and we are the fastest growing population. We are creating businesses at 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses, currently close to 70,000 Indigenous businesses. We've heard many times that economies thrive when all segments of society are actively engaged and given equal opportunities to participate and succeed. In Canada, business must play a crucial role in fostering this growth by actively engaging with Indigenous communities. At CCIB, we have a certification program called PAIR that enables organizations to set goals and measure against those goals in how they work with Indigenous peoples, communities, and businesses. This is not about corporate philanthropy and token gestures. It's about embedding thinking about how an organization can build relationships through inclusion. And this matters to consumers, to employees, and to shareholders. The companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange that are certified in this program outperformed the broader market by 80 basis points on an annualized basis. We've also seen strong benefits and partnerships, from fisheries to pipelines to energy projects. Indigenous ownership is bringing project certainty, sustainability, long-term partnerships, and reliable employment to corporations and projects for the benefit of both partners. Embracing diversity and inclusion is not just a moral imperative. It's a strategic business decision that drives long-term sustainability and growth. By fostering inclusive workplaces, companies attract top talent, bolster their reputation as responsible corporate businesses, and bring innovative practices and stability to projects. As leaders, we play a pivotal role in shaping policies and practices that promote economic prosperity. Remember that you, have a voice at tables that many communities are not invited to. By advocating for and conducting research that underscores the economic benefits of inclusion, diversity, and support of communities' economic development, you can drive meaningful change within public and private sectors. Miigwech.
Merci. Peut-être Christophe Leribaud.
Thank you, Christophe Leribaud. Maybe you want to react to what has been said, and as a representative of as a French citizen, would you like to defend the universalism and our universal traditions? Why should we keep this universal momentum? I'm talking from Versailles, which requires that we go back to the 18th century. We'll be a bit corporate here, because when facing communitarianism, which was very strong in a Europe that was very much scattered out with provinces, with a society with a strong hierarchy, with nobility, with clergy and so on. I'm not going to repeat history, but it was a situation that was very particular, with a lot of social chunks here and there. And with the Century of Lights, we wanted to bring enlightenment. Namely, we wanted to share resources beyond communities, beyond these groups. And that's because of traveling. There was also, due to exotism, sometimes it was stereotypes, of course, but it's also the rights of humankind and citizens. That was what was defended with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was defended, but it could also be seen as something that is specific to the old Europe. And maybe it was also, it gave rise to imperialism, because we thought at the time that we needed to give a voice and to disseminate those values that we thought were superior. And we should maybe be cautious about this use of these values that was the outcome of a long process of maturation in Europe. Because it was so fragmented at the time, these philosophers wanted to find a solution to get out of this. We have always been at the crossroads in Europe of different trends, So we wanted to create value, to have social cohesion, to go beyond this overlapping of values. I'm defending my parts, so museums and culture. I think that museums offer a representation of the world, different worlds, from a geographic point of view, but also throughout time, because all eras are represented. And we can discover and meet others. First of all, we are in awe of works of art, of course. There are codes in museums. Not everyone goes to museum, but we try to get out of this to attract as many people. As far as I'm concerned, there's not a shock of culture, a clash of cultures, but rather a clash of those that do not have cultures. Even if we're right in wanting to be proud of our origins, we should look at what the others do. In Versailles and in museums and in the world of culture, we do as much as we can to attract the young people and everything. The aim is not only to defend Louis XIV. That wouldn't work, actually, for foreigners. What we want to do is to create a think tank of talents with gardens, with architects, with landscape gardens, with fountain experts, musicians, and they could be Italian, German, French carpenters. And actually, the kings were multicultural because of their of their ancestors, coming from the Bourbon, for instance. And you also have the Jeu de Paume room, the ancestor of tennis, and where there was a Congress room. The Senate and the National Assembly could vote for an amendment to the Constitution quite unanimously. It was only 4 months ago. It's hard to think that. But this is a venue, Versailles, which is a place of wonder. We have to, and that instills trust in the diversity of the world. We can be very proud to have museums that are dedicated to such and such civilizations, to find oneself, but also to open it up to the others and to make experiments as to this diversity. So we go from a universalism that is too much, that has a facet of conquerors that is maybe to be dropped out, but it is the starting point of finding a way to find each other, all of us together again. Thank you, Christophe. Maybe that can resonate to what you're going to tell us, Mrs. Bintou Traoré. Can you explain to us how the taking on board of specific identity or identities of differences can help us reconcile communities? And maybe we should illustrate this with what could be done at the level of press coverage. Thank you. I come from the Côte d'Ivoire, and I'm a communitarist. I like to spend time with people that look like me, with my relatives, with those that have the same culture. And that makes me feel well and good. When I understood that I wanted to like what I was, that enabled me to go towards the others. I traveled, I studied in France, I studied at the Higher School of Journalism in Paris. And I found it easier to include myself, to integrate myself, because if I hadn't accepted who I was, I couldn't integrate in the world with other people. These two words are indeed not irreconcilable. They can be compatible. We can have differences, and we can go beyond these differences. We can have a society fraught with social cohesion. We have to respect, of course, the law of the country. We shouldn't rub off differences. As said earlier, and I agree with what was said, universalism of the past century, and you've talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it didn't include women, actually, at the time. We needed some time before women could actually be included in the Universal Declaration of humans. It should be also men and women. And also, regarding universalism, they tried to show, and the question that I wonder about that subject, what are the values that are conveyed? Is that a consensus? Because we are in a world that is a globalized world, and we need to open the debate, to open the debate and think about what we mean by universalism. We're not it's not the 19th century anymore. A lot of things have happened since then. I work in the media world. Before, I was in front of the camera, now I'm behind the camera. And I thought it was very important to show my perception of the world instead of blaming everyone, saying that people that I don't like are in front of the camera. I thought, okay, I should actually take the bull by the horns and do something about it so that we don't have stereotypes. I'm not saying that everything that is showed is all linked to racism. It's not true. And we are evolving in the media. We have a plurality of medias with different angles and different mindsets. And we can have different representations with a faithful representation of Black people, Arab people, white people. And I think it's a good way, it's a good thing, because regarding perception and the way people and information can be processed, I think that human beings are sacred, and we should have freedom of speech. And medias need to go towards diversity. In France, nowadays, we have a culture, we have traditions, values, and identity. But it is actually an identity that is full of a variety of identities, and this is what we should show.
If we could ponder a little bit about the question of the media, because the situation is completely different in the United States and in Canada. So Tabitha Bull, could you perhaps say a couple of words about how the media can play a role in smoothing out these differences and in finding reconciliation between the communities?
Sure, thank you. You know, in Canada, we've had, as I said, the history with Indigenous people is really coming to light for a number of people. More recently, there was confirmation of graves at what were called residential schools. And at that time, the media wanted to tell that story. But it's a difficult story to tell. It took up a lot of media space, and it really started to open up a conversation. That is continuing to happen, but the media has moved on to other things. And I think also, you know, there are stereotypes that the media, you know, seems to be stories that are picked up and are, you know, perhaps that gets more stories or more readers. And that's about that Indigenous people are anti-infrastructure or anti-build, and that's really not the case. It's a better story to tell, to see blockades of pipelines and blockades of building, but there are a number of communities that are partnering on infrastructure projects that want to be part of that economic build. And too often we see the media tell the story that gets the bigger tell or the bigger space versus really celebrating that Indigenous excellence and partnership. So it does put us into that stereotype of being anti-development when that's really not the case.
Merci. Christopher Caldwell, passons à un autre.
Christopher Caldwell, perhaps let's move on to another participant in this equation. What about the state? When we were preparing our meeting, you were saying that in some American states, when communities which used to be majority became a minority, that could cause chaos. Would you like to give us a little more information about that and come back on the policies that can be implemented by the state? Yes, as I said, I think there are quite a few paradoxes here. I was struck by what Tabitha was saying a few moments ago. on the subject of that real difference that is involved in diversity. Universalism involves equality. It's difficult to put into practice, but the principle is of the law. We have laws about equality, etc. There are communities that are very specific, that have their own unique characteristics. And a state has to treat these people differently. The German government owes a debt to the Jews in a different way that it owes a debt to gays or to immigrants or anybody else. It's really easy to kind of get muddled up when you're looking at differences between historical duties, such as the United States have to their population of color. And there's a basic duty of equality there. So in my country, we have created laws to make up for certain injustices in the 1960s. This is unique to the United States. However, by doing that, we created a new government system that was very useful for managing several rights issues. The rights of homosexuals, for women, for those who speak a different language. So one might wonder whether it's legitimate to use a system of laws which are created for some historical emergency. And is it fair to use them to ends that are not linked to historical guilt? There is an impression, a growing impression, that these systems are overused to ends for which they were not created. And that creates complications in the states, where there was a former majority. In California, for example, where the former majority has become a minority. And they are starting to claim and demand protection of their own interests, such as in the language of civic rights. Are you talking about the Spanish-speaking population there for California? Yes, but there are other immigrants as well, other immigrant communities in California. The whites in California are now a minority, and non-Spanish speaking whites I'm referring to. So Christophe Leribaud from Versailles, would you like to react to that and to the policy which may be implemented on this front? You've talked about universalism and the role of culture. Do you want to react to what Christopher Caldwell's just said? Well, in the United States, there are a lot of combats for communities, for reasons of identity and all the rest. There are 1,000 different combats which are possible, which have made progress and taken steps forward, but we can caricature some of this, which in France, for example, we're going through it right now for political reasons, possibly because these steps forward have been highlighted and showcased and immediate rather than being gradual. And there's swings and balances here, and the seesaw might tip up again. There are different people involved, but the main thing is to explain how complex the world is, how complex things are. Nothing is simple. Everything is a question of construction. Being a militant is a great thing, but it involves taking risks. Sometimes it can be a role that comes down to culture or education or media or politicians to explain how we've got to this point, how we can fine-tune things, how we can take things forward by explaining to everyone so that they all become aware, so that we all become aware of how deeply complicated things are. And I think we've come too far in the media and in social media and the media in general. Either you're for something or against something, it's black or it's white, but you have to understand, you have to grasp the contours of it all. Let's not all just stand firmly entrenched in our own certitudes. We seem to lack a kind of depth of analysis. Well, thank you very much. We can now open up the floor for questions. We are trying to not talk about the political situation here in France. It's a bit of a hot topic, and of course it is tied in with the question we're addressing today. So let's not be political in this debate, but we're opening up the floor to questions. Perhaps we can take a microphone to the person who would like to ask a question. On the front row, we've got a person. Yeah, indeed. Here in France, we're going through dark times. It's a time of regression, and it's very costly in terms of society and economics as well. And it means that we have to address an urgent situation. Today, the emergency is perhaps once the elections are over, we need to promote a ministry for integration that could be founded on the coexistence of different cultures, so that we could drive forward policies for education, to intervene in the media and also in businesses as well. So that's a comment rather than a question. We had a Ministry of National Identity a while ago, and you're suggesting a Ministry for Integration this time. So that's another avenue to be explored. So does such a type of ministry exist in Canada or in the States or in Côte d'Ivoire? No, in Côte d'Ivoire we don't need that because we're all rather homogenous. There's less cultural diversity than here, given our history and everything. In Canada, do you need such a ministry?
So we have a ministry focused on Indigenous people. Unfortunately, the history of that was actually about assimilation, so really universalism and removing all of the culture. And now that ministry is really there to help support Indigenous communities in recognizing the culture and the benefits. That ministry also does look at policy around economic development for communities. But then we have a separate ministry that's focused on women, so a ministry really specific to gender issues and women, and any policy that goes through in the government of Canada initially goes through a gender analysis and also an analysis around Indigenous people to understand the benefit that policy will have to gender specifically, and also looking at Indigenous people. So there are ministries there. We still have a lot of work to do to ensure that the people that those policies are affecting are at the table when the policies are developed and not afterwards. There's work to be done there, but the ministries do exist.
Oui, aux États-Unis, nous n'avons.
In the United States, we don't have a ministry for integration. However, integration is deeply anchored in our national character, our national personality. We don't have your universalism, however. In theory, it would be possible to establish a community with a different language or with a different religion, because very few people have changed. We've got a lot of integration, a lot of assimilation, but very few people have changed their religion when they've arrived in the States. So things happen a little bit differently in the States. We do not have such ministries, but we have not felt the need for such ministries. Thank you very much. Yes, there's a lady there who'd like to ask a question. So I would like to know what kind of compensation was given by the government to the black population. Germany gave money to Jewish people, or to the Jewish community. And in France at the beginning of the 90s, and I'm witness to that, that was the case of my family, it was the same case in France as in Germany. So what did you do in the States? Well, what did we do in the States to make up for past situations? Well, the worst case of all was those civic laws of 1964. And we, in fact, took it to the courts. We used the legal system. And that meant that people could lodge official complaints against private companies that would recruit in a discriminatory way. Or you could lodge a complaint against a public authority that was demonstrating some kind of unfair behavior. We spent a lot of money doing that, but it wasn't really targeted in terms of community or identity. In fact, never. That was never the case. However, these laws went hand in hand with another program, which was called the Great Society, which is an umbrella name for many, many programs. It involved building apartments, and it involved the welfare state for food, money. But a lot of money was loaned out. Some say that tens of trillions of dollars were lent out. But the target was never in function of ethnic identity or community. So perhaps I could ask Tabitha, in Canada, you've got your First Nation. Did you have that kind of help for your First Nations in Canada?
Yeah, so in Canada, there's a number of different ways. So first, the rights of Indigenous people are enshrined in our Constitution. So for example, if a business is developing or doing resource extraction, they are legally required to work with the community that they're impacting. There have been many times that has not happened in the past, and that has gone into the courts, and there have been settlements. Many First Nation communities also have treaties with the government that were signed. The treaty that I belong to is called Robinson-Huron Treaty. We had a signatory with the government, and that meant that we were to be compensated for the resource extracted from our land, and we were able to continue to hunt and fish within that land. That treaty settlement payment was supposed to be increased every year since 1860, and it was not. So we're actually going through a settlement process right now, 30 communities that belong to that treaty, with the federal government for a payment to ensure that that moves on. And that could mean up to again, billions of dollars that will be paid in settlement for past wrongs that have happened. And there are a number of those type of land claim settlements that are also happening where land was taken from communities without any payment or retribution. So there are land claim settlements that are happening also. And then one of the most recent settlements is for the residential school survivors, the children that went to residential school or were taken and not come home. There has been monetary settlements to those individuals as well.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a une question? Oui, madame.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Another question. Thank you very much for this really interesting conversation and debate. I've got two questions. My first is from Mr. Caldwell about the Florida situation. I wrote the biography of the person in question. The CIA is involved in the debate. And a question also for Chloe. Do you think that communitarianism and economics can live side by side? Well, I would say that the backlash against the PDI was very, very strong. However, as I also said, let's take the Trump vote. We didn't really explain what the program was until after 2020. However, there was a DEI culture, even back in 2016. So there was a very strong backlash. However, as I said earlier on, I believe that multiculturalism is more a legal thing than a cultural thing. And all of the DEI mechanisms are still in place. We've talked about changes in society where the majority group becomes a minority group. Over years, as years have gone by, we've seen several programs of these becoming more ambitious. For example, positive discrimination. These programs remain in place. There's a lot of contestation, but not too much change in terms of the programs. And the second question? I believe that communitarianism can also be seen, as I said earlier on, as a protective mechanism. It can be for cultural protection or protection against economic insecurity. And the fact of being tethered to a community in an economy which is increasingly difficult and brutal and unstable, with rules that you don't understand necessarily. I'm talking about delocalization, for example, mechanisms which are suffered as something which is very brutal by many people in the population. So I think communitarianism can be considered as a shock absorber. And it can gain recognition for the individual, recognition that the individual is not finding elsewhere in the economic world. What strikes me is that policies to promote diversity and inclusion are policies that businesses embrace, and I think they embrace them more strongly than the state does. That's the case in France, particularly for international companies, with programs that can be quite far-reaching. And one might say that liberalism can rise to this challenge of diversity and inclusion. I'm not sure in a more effective way, but at least it's quicker and it's more agile. So yes, Bintou, you'd like to come back on that. Well, what I think is that we can get beyond communitarianism and go towards universalism. But to do that, we need to all talk together. Universalism cannot be imposed upon people. You need to have horizontal relationships, not vertical. You have to open a dialogue. And I think since the beginning of time, there has been time to talk. We've talked about the Human Rights Declaration and the Women's Rights Declaration. We had a charter in Mali, for example, in Africa, this was the first time that Africans sat down around the table to have a shared charter which had the values of democracy, gender equality, and fair laws. So I think we've always been able to talk about how we can act in different places, whether in Asia, Europe, Africa, so that we can have shared values, universal values. We can always do better. I think today, what with globalization and with access to information and with new technologies, I think we really are in a position to be able to determine what we want as universalism, what kind we want, and we can declare that there are certain values that are just we cannot be debated. You must never harm your neighbor. You mustn't kill. You mustn't steal. You mustn't hurt anybody or anything. These are values, I think, which everyone should be able to agree about. They're horizontal. We need to have this universalism which is on a horizontal basis, not a vertical basis which is imposed and thrust upon everybody. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're not going to have time for the final questions. Apologies to those people who've raised their hands. I would just like to specify, before I hand over to Chloe for the conclusion, that Douglas Kennedy is coming here to do a masterclass on this book here. It's called, you can see it on the screen there, C'est ainsi que nous vivons. If you want to see him, and you can stay in the tent afterwards. However, let's get back to Chloe. Yes, there are a lot of differences between the French model and the models in the English-speaking world. And that is why we've had such a rich conversation. We've been able to identify the different limits, etc. And I have started to think more carefully about opposing the goals of diversity and the goals of inclusion, the fact that they can, in fact, be antagonistic. So that's a very interesting line of thought. And more generally, we are going through a crisis of the universalist model, particularly in France here, but we see the same thing in other Western democracies as well. It's being contested on the one hand by those who consider that this universalist model does not guarantee equality and inclusion. And on the other hand, we've got those who consider that there is too much diversity, and that diversity is fragmenting the national community, leading to separatism, as we mentioned in the introduction. So, given this framework, the legitimate players are not going to be the same depending on which country you're in. In France, we'd say that the state is legitimate in this role, above all, whereas in the United States or in the UK, there are many things which are driven by companies and company groupings. That doesn't mean that businesses in France aren't doing anything, but in terms of political culture, the profiles are very, very different. And one of the problems that we have here in France is that we are going through a crisis of government efficacy. And it's all linked to public finances, but that's not the only factor. And that is surely why the problem of the fragmentation of our country is becoming such a major and pressing issue today. Thank you very much, everybody.